This is our world, a vast web of humanity exchanging ideas and culture and technology. But it wasn't always this way. For some 10,000 years, the globe was split into two isolated spheres, each unaware of the other's existence. Then in 1492, the so-called Old World collided with the New, unleashing a cascade of devastation unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. What followed was, I believe, without parallel, the darkest chapter in human history. This video tells the tragic story of the destruction of the people of the Amazon rainforest and, through its lens, the Holocaust of the entire Western Hemisphere. These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present. In the last video, we took a dive into what we know and what we don't about the Amazon before the Europeans arrived. How for some 10,000 years, the people of the Amazon managed the forest and learnt to thrive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Well, in the year 1500, this world was shattered forever when a set of strange-looking ships appeared at the mouth of the Amazon and sailed up it. The Spaniard Vicente Yáñez Pinzón didn't know what he was seeing. He thought it might be the Ganges in India. Likewise, in the folklore of one of the indigenous tribes on the banks of the river, the Europeans and their sailboats are remembered as a swarm of flying ants. The first encounter didn't last long. Pinzón met the natives, had a skirmish, and took 36 men home as slaves. Another 40 years passed, and life in Amazonia continued much as it always had. But the time bomb was ticking. Two hemispheres were colliding with tragic effects. After discovering South America, Europeans began to occasionally come to trade along the Atlantic coast, mainly for Brazilwood, after which Brazil gets its name. But to this first wave of Europeans, these primitive peoples of the Amazon didn't seem to have the precious metals, jewels, textiles, ivory, or spices that they were hungry for. The Amazon was low down their list of priorities. The next glimpse that outsiders got of the Amazon was with the expedition of Francisco de Orellana in 1541. By 1533, high in the Andes, the Spanish had toppled the Inca Empire and had become captivated by whispers of a land so wealthy that the ruler covered himself in gold. This was El Dorado. Now, from the Spanish perspective, it wasn't completely crazy. In the previous 25 years, the Spanish had discovered and conquered the Aztecs and Maya in Mexico, Incas in Peru, and the Muisca in Colombia. Each of these civilizations was fabulously wealthy, and the conquistadors, often uneducated if not criminal armed entrepreneurs from Spain, had become some of the world's wealthiest men. Why couldn't there be a fourth glittering prize? So Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of Francisco Pizarro, who led the group that brought down the Inca, assembled a force of some 200 Spaniards, which was more than Francisco had when he overthrew the entire Inca Empire, along with as many as 4,000 native porters, along with llamas, pigs, and livestock. In 1541, they marched out of Quito. They started in the high grasslands amid snow-capped volcanoes, then descended the Andean slopes. They were the best fighting men in Europe, and with their horses and swords had proven themselves nearly invincible in the Andes and in Mexico and the Caribbean. But now they were heading into the Amazon rainforest, and they were completely and utterly out of their depth. Before long, the expedition had depleted their supplies, desperately fighting and torturing tribes for information of the City of Gold. They were helplessly lost and time was running out. So they decided the best option was to split up. One half would build rafts and canoes and head downriver, while the rest would follow along by land. The men in the boats would be led by Francisco de Orellana, who was 30 years old. Floating on the current of the river, they covered some 1,000 kilometers in 8 days. They were way beyond the point of no return. They would have to keep going. This was the first time Europeans had ever penetrated into the heart of the Amazon. Continuing downriver, they stopped in at the settlements on the riverbanks, alternatively bartering their remaining trinkets for fish, turtles, monkeys, and manatees, but just as often getting into skirmishes. Most of what we know comes from the written accounts of Friar Gaspar de Carvajal. He wrote about being told of the Amazons, a tribe of warrior women who lived together without men, except for intercourse once a year, killed all the male children, keeping only the females. The legend comes from at least as far back as classical Greece, but here in the New World, the name stuck. As historian John Hemming puts it, the world's largest river is called after the legendary tribe of sexually liberated women. After 5 months of this, they reached the ocean. There, without a compass, anchors, maps, or any experienced sailors, as well as very little food or water, they sailed out into the Atlantic, along the coast of the Guianas, past Trinidad and the Orinoco, to the island of Margarita, already a Spanish colony. An open voyage of 2,200 kilometers. It was one of the greatest explorations of all time. Of the original 59 men, they had only lost 6 to battle, disease, or starvation. But that isn't what most interests us. What do they actually see in their 5 months floating down the Amazon? First are the reports that stretches of the Amazon were densely populated in well-organized chiefdoms. Near the mouth of the Tapajós, they found a settlement that lined the riverbank for 100 miles. How much can we believe? Well, we certainly have to take it with a grain of salt. But if for no other reason, we have to look at this account because this world was about to disappear forever because of something the Spaniards, indeed many of the citizens of the Old World, were carrying with them in their veins and in their lungs. We'll get to that soon. It will be another 70 years or so before the Europeans really turned their attention to the Amazon. They thought the lush vegetation of the jungle signaled a fertility that they could profitably exploit. By this point, the Portuguese had now occupied the entire Atlantic seaboard of Brazil and ejected a French settlement in Maranhão. The Portuguese now had a century of experience in Brazil, spoke Tupi, which they could use to communicate, had some familiarity with the ways of South America's indigenous people, and had learned to fight, somewhat, in this tropical environment, as well as having the world's best navy. With this, they could outcompete the other Europeans. Now, the weird thing is, it really shouldn't have been theirs. In the Great Catholic Carve-Up, which was 1494's Treaty of Tordesillas, the Pope divided the world between Portugal and Spain, along a meridian 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the east of it was to be Portugal's, which included the trade routes to India, while everything west of it, essentially all of the Americas except for a tiny slice of the eastern tip, should have been Spain's. But that is not how things played out. In 1580, following a convoluted succession drama, the Portuguese and Spanish crowns merged to create the dual monarchy. The thing was, in South America, the Spaniards had the wealth of the Incas in Peru to feast upon, and descending into the hostile, seemingly empty rainforest, especially after their disastrous earlier attempts to find El Dorado, really didn't appeal. And with Portugal and Spain officially ruled by the same king, what was the rush? But there was mischief afoot. The interim governor of Maranhão came up with a plan. He sent a massive expedition of 47 canoes, carrying 70 Portuguese, paddled by 1,100 native Amazonians, to force its way up the Amazon against the current, and the captain of the mission had sealed orders that he was only to open as he was entering the Spanish province of Quito. He opened the envelope, and the instructions told him to found a Portuguese settlement and erect boundary markers with the Portuguese coat of arms. In August 1639, he planted these stones a full 2,400 kilometers west of the line of Tordesillas. Portugal and Spain divorced a year later, and the Spanish were too busy with wars in Europe to do much about this new line. There was little resistance to the Portuguese claiming most of the seemingly useless Amazon basin, and the boundary was consummated 100 years later in the 1750 Treaty of Madrid, and essentially gave Brazil the size it is today, half the continent of South America and 2/3 of the Amazon basin. The indigenous inhabitants were totally ignored, and the borders split the territories of tribes the Europeans didn't even know of yet. The Spanish hadn't even bothered to descend from the Andes and claim the Amazon forest that was supposed to be theirs. So now, with no rivals to speak of, the Portuguese had the freedom to embark on centuries of merciless exploitation. As John Hemming put it, to paraphrase Churchill, rarely in human history has so much damage been done to so many by so few. A few thousand colonists gradually destroyed almost every human being along thousands of kilometers of the main river and its tributaries. How did that happen? We will come to that next, because now we are going to embark on our own journey down the world's biggest river. I was traveling down the Amazon with my friends Dan and Leticia.
travel down the Amazon River today is to see the fruit of the historical process that began when two hemispheres met. The very faces of the Amazon's people are the products of history, because in the entire Amazon today, the vast majority of people are not indigenous Americans, but mixed race. And yet, with the epic sweep of history as a background, you also have the foreground. The mundane world of people living out their lives in ways which are entirely normal and ordinary to them. And to be on an Amazonian riverboat, lying in a hammock with a light breeze coming off the river, watching the world go by, is a truly lovely way to ruminate on human history. A journey from Manaus to Santarem, depending on the boat and the time of year, can take well over 24 hours, allowing you to see the full cycle of the day. As you go downriver, you make stops along the way, giving you a peek into another self-contained little world that one set of humans have created in their little corner of the planet. You watch the people and wonder about their lives, people you will never meet, but each of them playing their part on the stage that history built for them. And then the boat pulls out and off you go, on your way downriver, towards more and different worlds.
We left off with the Portuguese now firmly in control of Brazil. In 1621, the Portuguese had separated both Maranhão and Greater Pará from the rest of Brazil. The trade winds and currents actually made it easier to sail across the Atlantic than down the coast to Bahia or Rio, the capitals of the colony of Brazil. So until the 1770s, the Amazon was actually ruled directly from Portugal. So how and why did the destruction of the Amazon's people happen? The Europeans who had left the old continent had staked it all on moving to the New World. Even if they had just been simple farmers back home, they were absolutely determined to be free of anything that looked like hard work. Having escaped the caste system of the old world, survived the dangerous journey across the ocean, they felt they deserved to be treated like royalty. Given the king needed to profit from his colonies and was trying to persuade his people to actually go to Brazil, he always gave in. And aside from that, they could barely fend for themselves in the rainforest. The colonists needed people to feed them, build their towns, and to paddle them wherever they went. Even though the transatlantic slave trade was starting to roar into gear, Amazonia was simply too poor to afford the slaves that were at that moment being imported onto the sugar plantations of northeast Brazil, so they relied entirely on the native people for just about everything. The work happened in two ways. Free indigenous people were persuaded downriver to live near the European towns in official native communities. In these, they were forced to work for the settlers or local government for a certain portion of the year, say half of it or more. So from 1620 onwards, these expeditions would be sent up the river every single year, paddled by Amazonians, and very often stocked with indigenous fighters. With guns and trade goods, persuasion and brute force, tens or hundreds of thousands of native peoples were enslaved, legally, and all under the wicked pretense of it being for their own good. They weren't being enslaved, they were being saved, and the Pope approved. There's no avoiding the fact that a massive part of the justification for this was Christianity. Missionaries accompanied these expeditions. They needed souls for their missions. They would be turned into good Christians who were productive subjects of the crown and forced to work. Surely a small price to pay for salvation. Then there was the lawful slavery. Any tribe that resisted either Portuguese rule or conversion to Christianity could be captured and legally enslaved. Or, if there were indigenous people who were already enslaved by other indigenous people, these slaves could be legally purchased. The theory behind this came from a practice of some Tupi-speaking peoples far away on the coast, who would execute and ritually eat their prisoners of war. Because being eaten was less desirable than being enslaved, it was ruled lawful for Portuguese to buy indigenous prisoners of war from other groups in what was called ransoming, who would then be slaves for life of their liberator. It didn't matter that the practice of ritual cannibalism was practically unknown in this part of the continent. One tribe could be easily persuaded to attack another, capture prisoners of war, who would be sold to the Europeans. It worked for that tribe until the same process was turned on them. An inspector sent by the king in 1721 confirmed that almost every settler in the Amazon, from governors down, held illegal slaves. Fundamentally, with the incentives as they were, and being deep in the jungle so far from any effective law enforcement, this system was open to utter, rampant abuse. One Jesuit writes of the settlers, "They kill Indians as one kills mosquitoes. In labor they treat them as if they were wild animals or beasts of the forest, and they use or abuse the feminine sex brutally and lasciviously, monstrously and indecently, without fear of God or shame before their fellow men." The settlers worked them without mercy because they depended on these slaves for everything they had. Ultimately, the missionaries had to compromise with the settlers. They were complicit in accompanying the expeditions and legitimizing the enslavement of native people. I should say that in many cases, the Jesuits did want the best for the indigenous Amazonians, or what they thought was best. The Jesuits would sometimes be arrested or frozen out, and a decade would pass in which slaving was completely unrestricted. Then another law would be passed back in Lisbon outlawing slavery, which would be followed by a backlash, and local authorities would evict the Jesuits or not enforce the law, or there would be a settler rebellion and Lisbon would change its mind once again. By the mid-17th century, much of the Amazon River had been depopulated. The teeming villages reported by early explorers were all gone. All that was left was a handful of mission villages, which the missionaries had to constantly restock with expeditions further into the forest. We have long lists made by missionaries at the time of tribes that were still to be contacted. Almost all of them are now extinct. In 1748, a royal decree finally put an official stop to ransom expeditions and the legal enslavement of the Amazonians. The king issued the Law of Liberties, giving freedom and self-government to the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, which included all the rights and privileges of ordinary citizens, such as being able to work and trade with whoever they chose. The law even mandated a type of affirmative action, saying that they should be preferred for posts and occupations, and capable of any employment, honor, and dignity. The law was liberal, progressive, and completely unimplemented. Of course, the natives would still need guidance, so a white director was then assigned to each model village, not for religious instruction, but to guide them to become civilized and help them make a profit. This was to be called the directorate. Indigenous people were required to adopt European surnames, wear modest clothing, and live in separate houses instead of their traditional communal huts. Half the indigenous men between 13 and 60 had to be available at all times to work for the settlers and government. The goal was to merge the races, and white settlers were encouraged to live in the villages and marry interracially. These directors were little dictators, keeping harems of native women and forcing their subjects to labor for the settlers, who would work them to death growing cocoa, sugar, and cotton. Enslaved Amazonians were branded across the chest with the full names of their owners. Women and girls were sold for sex. Word spread throughout the Amazon. Being captured by the whites was worse than death. This resulted in the further scattering of indigenous people across the rainforest and across the continent. We have written accounts of how, in the late 16th century, 84 villages of Tupinamba migrated away from the Portuguese oppressors on the Atlantic seaboard, across South America and the foothills of the Andes in Bolivia, where the Spanish recorded their arrival. They then descended the Madeira River to Tupinambarana Island near Manaus. The Portuguese found them there in 1639 and wrote about how the old Tupinamba men recalled their homeland in Pernambuco. In just 2 generations, they had migrated some 5,600 kilometers. Even in the 1970s, uncontacted tribes were still terrified of the Europeans, word of their cruelty having been passed down from generation to generation. Indeed, this fear of the white man is still alive and well in the remaining uncontacted tribes that still exist today. Some indigenous nations resisted, but not for long. It was always possible for the Portuguese to co-opt one tribe against another. The slaving expeditions pushed further and further upriver and resorted to dirtier and dirtier tricks. They would erect a cross on the shore, and when the Amazonians would pass by it without supplicating, this was taken as a rejection of Christianity. Often the slavers would force their captives to say incriminating answers in Portuguese, a language they didn't speak. They were hauled downriver in chains, with any sick natives thrown overboard to stop the spread of disease. It was in nobody's interest for the indigenous people to be exterminated. The crown hoped they would one day be loyal subjects. The church needed them to fulfill their soul counts and make their mission villages work. The settlers needed them to work. But the destruction happened anyway. The fact is, though, that the vast majority of indigenous people of the Americas died not from cruelty or subjugation, though there was plenty of that, but from disease, and it happened quickly. There were epidemics of smallpox, measles, cholera, influenza, tuberculosis, yellow fever, malaria, and many more for which we have no names. Having spent tens of thousands of years separated from the illnesses of the Old World, the native peoples of the Amazon, indeed all of the Americas, died in droves. Undoubtedly, there were many tribes and nations that were obliterated before their names could even be recorded, and which we will never know. It was an utter demographic catastrophe. And this is where it intersects with the subject of the previous video, about what we know and don't know about the Amazon, and whether it hosted complex civilizations before European arrival. The death rates caused by disease didn't just kill people, they destroyed cultures. According to a 2022 study in the American Journal of the Medical Sciences, 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas were killed by infectious diseases in the years following European colonization. You heard that right, 95% of the entire hemisphere. If 95% of people in your community or your country die, what exactly is left? Remember that many of these diseases raced ahead of actual European arrival in an area. So when Europeans did show up, what exactly were they seeing? As Charles Mann writes in his book 1491, the so-called primitive people many Europeans encountered in the Americas were actually the persecuted survivors of a recently shattered culture. It was as if you had come across the refugees from a Nazi concentration camp and concluded that they belonged to a culture that had always been barefoot and starving. Living in the era of antibiotics, we find it difficult to imagine the simultaneous deaths of siblings, parents, relatives, and friends. Disease turned whole societies to ash. How can we imagine what it means to have entire ways of life hiss away like steam? How can one assay the total impact of the unprecedented calamity that gave rise to the world we live in? It seems important to try. So when we think of the native people of the Americas as nomadic hunters, a large part of that is because most of the heavily populated urban societies were wiped out. All because nobody had the slightest idea about diseases, how they worked, how they spread, and how they were treated. And like I said, this was in nobody's interest. The missionaries saw their missions melt in front of their eyes. The settlers saw their workers collapse in boils and pustules. Slaving expeditions would corral their captives into groups on the riverbanks, but by the time they came to embark, half were already dead, and another quarter would die on the journey downriver. The awful irony is that while in coastal Brazil the sugar industry made many men fabulously wealthy, In the Amazon, all of this destruction of human life was for nothing. The Europeans completely failed to understand the Amazon. The most lucrative crops, sugar, cotton, tobacco, cacao, and coffee, grew terribly in the rainforest. It was too hot and too wet, and pests devoured the crops or they were infected by blight. There were no diamonds or gold mines in the Amazon. And yet the enslavement went on. The model villages of the friars were ravaged by disease, and the deeper the slaving expeditions went, the further they spread the epidemics. And in the Amazon, which would never make the profits of the sugar plantations, they were even too poor to import many Africans. Instead, they simply destroyed the natives, leaving almost nothing behind. By the time they reached their lowest point in the middle of the 20th century, the population of indigenous people living in the entire Amazon forest was around 200,000. Some believe that fewer people live in rural Amazonia now than in 1491. But soon, the Europeans would find something they wanted. It's a story of industrialization and globalization, and how the world's greatest rainforest was transformed by a single global commodity. The next video tells the story of the rubber boom.